As I earlier mentioned, that 38,900 infrastructure projects have been supported. In terms of supporting community institutions, 147,000 community institutions have been fostered so far, and mainly it's through rural support programs and our other partners. And more than 1 million people have been provided skills through 18,000 events.
In various catastrophes, because as I mentioned that normally whatever efforts you make to bring that poor family out of poverty, but there's one shock of flood or earthquake or COVID or health shock, it's against zero-sum game. So PPF has been at the forefront complementing Government of Pakistan's effort in almost all catastrophes across the country. In 2005 earthquake, beside provision of relief, early recovery, support in various sectors, we supported these communities through our partners and constructed 122,000 seismic resistance shelter in earthquake affected areas. And then there was 2010 flood, and there was at various places there had been earthquake, there had been again 2022 flood, and recently the flood in River Satluj that hit 6 districts of Punjab. So we are always at the forefront. Whatever meager resources we have, we provide support to these communities. Although sometimes it is seen that whatever efforts of improving economic income poverty at that household, one flood has taken them again back down. But again, then I'll highly appreciate Government of Pakistan that through Benazir Income Support Program, they've always provided support through cash transfer. Next. Basically, the strategic trajectory of poverty alleviation, what PPF has learned and what it has, we have tried to, based on lessons learned, revise our strategy. From 2000 to 2005, it was basically institutional development. We focused mainly on social mobilization, on organizing communities. And there was single product microfinance to support poor families. And then standalone village level infrastructure projects that we supported in 96 districts of the country. From 2006 to 2009, we went to scale with the support of Government of Pakistan. It was multi-sector interventions, institutional development, water, energy, health and education pilots in 127 districts. And during this phase, as I just mentioned, in 2005, there was earthquake. So emergency response and reconstruction was supported. A special program for social mobilization was also launched through rural support programs, and testing livelihood various approaches in these 127 districts. And then based on lessons learned, we thought to take it to strategic depth, whatever interventions we undertake for sustainability. So integrated, inclusive, and multidimensional approach was introduced. Second generation institutional support for livelihood was extended. Scaling up assets creation, poverty graduation, and testing robustness. Scaling up financial inclusion through microfinance as well as interest-free loan. Because one of the lessons that we learned was that microfinance basically does not reaches to the extremely vulnerable poor population, particularly in poverty scorecard from 0 to 18, because they're completely assetless. They cannot take loan and do something for their earning. So that was the lessons learned that then we requested Government of Pakistan, and we were grateful to Government of Pakistan that they provided 8 billion rupees in 2013 and 20 to provide interest-free loans. And also this interest-free loan has enhanced its access to communities which basically don't like the interest. They're mostly faith-based and they don't like interest-based product. So interest-free loan was also acceptable in those communities, and we reached out to more than 2.9 million households in those communities. Next, building blocks for foster inclusion and impacting poverty. So integrated approach to social mobilization, infrastructure, health and education, and livelihood was kind of outcome of the same approach. The pathway graduating household out of poverty, graduating them from reliance on safety net to mainstreaming into formal economy through productive access, financial inclusion, skills, value chain, and entrepreneurship. So that's another lesson learned, that previously, initially, we were just targeting we thought that there are 3 products through which we can graduate these poor people out of poverty. But now we have learned and we have started working on value chain as well as entrepreneurship to put it at scale, because when you strengthen value chains, when you support small and medium enterprises, so it not only helps the poor farmer to improve his or her income, but at the same time creates more employment opportunities in those areas. And then fostering social capital for participatory development, giving voice and empowerment to communities. So we are committed to leave no one behind and promote sustainability in those areas. This is basically our success of poverty graduation approach that we are trying to complement government of Pakistan. So these are 5 categories of poverty and non-poor people. So using the poverty scorecard that I just mentioned to you, from 0 to 16 or 18, this is basically extremely poor people, as well as the chronically poor people. So 0 to 11, it's extremely poor, and 12 to 18, it's chronically poor people. These are people that we think, हम कहते हैं ना कि ज़कात और खैरात के मुस्तहिक हैं. They're completely assetless people. And these are the target group that Benazir Income Support Program targets them through cash transfer. And Government of Pakistan, we must appreciate, is implementing one of the largest social protection program in the country. And then it comes to poverty scorecard 23 and below. So for them, it's basically community empowerment, assets creation, skill development, employment centers, production centers, and development of enabling environment, and small infrastructure, support in renewable energy, education, and health. So this is a target group that if you want to take them out of poverty, so you have to support them in improving of their income, as well as supporting them in the multidimensional poverty also. So people, again, the third category, which is basically much better, one can say, it's basically transitional vulnerable or transitory non-poor. For them, it's there are common interest groups, asset strengthening, empowering the employment centers again, production centers, strengthening value chains and marketing. Well, these are people who are 2 categories above poverty, so they have capability to improve their businesses, to improve their livelihood through value chain and market linkages. And then we have a group which is, one can say, non-poor, poverty scorecard 50. So for this group, what we think is, if you want to graduate them, if you want to further improve their living standard, we have to invest in value chain. We have to enhance financial services, particularly microfinance, and creating and strengthening entrepreneurship in those areas, and business approaches. Poverty scorecard above 50 up to 100, this is basically non-poor group. And for that, you need to have activities that contributes to macroeconomic growth of the country that would also support this group to improve their businesses, to improve their entrepreneurship, to create more employment opportunities for more national economic growth. So this is basically, ladies and gentlemen, a model of poverty graduation that has been tested. And there are various studies that have been conducted in Pakistan, which has demonstrated that this graduation model really works. And I'm very pleased to share with you that World Bank basically took this approach, and it's being implemented in Iraq. BRAC has taken the similar model, although it was BRAC had done a lot of work on this in Africa also. So it's being implemented in Africa. Last year, there was a group from World Bank who wanted to upscale these kind of interventions to Jordan, to other areas. So it's basically, it has now become an internationally acceptable model. And we also try to present it to our policy makers that we need to decide exit strategy for Benazir Income Support Program. We need to give empowerment to people to start catching fish, to start earning livelihood, rather than depending on the fish that government of Pakistan provide. So I'll just show you some slides. I'll not go into those details because I know the time is well short. So these have been some, there have been some studies that have proven the uptake of graduation in Pakistan for poverty alleviation. And integrated approach to poverty alleviation, like in 2013-21, integrated program for poverty reduction focused on social and economic development of grassroots communities through development of small infrastructure, provision of health and education services, skill development, training, and sustainable livelihood opportunities. It was funded by Italian 40 million euro debt swap program, and it covered 38 union council. And you can see the result, which has been given below, that how it contributed to addressing the poverty and what are the outcomes of the same. Scaling up graduation in Pakistan, Government of Pakistan through IFAD funding launched a program, National Poverty Graduation Program, and based on the success of PPF graduation model, and it still continues. It's being implemented in various districts of country. Next. Promoting inclusive development. So we, most of stakeholders, they keep coming to us that what are the results, what is the approach. So UNHCR basically, when we presented this model to them, they thought that it's a good model and it can be replicated for Afghan refugees also. So when they go back to their countries, they can, when they live here until the situation get normalized in Afghanistan, so they can start earning a livelihood in Pakistan. So this program is now being implemented for Afghan refugee also. And this year, we are trying to provide this support to 3,000 Afghan refugee families in KP and Balochistan. It's again the same intervention that I just highlighted. So from 2017, basically, we are working with Afghan refugees. So the evidence on infrastructure and services. So PPF's renewable energy infrastructure has offered 59% EIRR and increased access of 91% household to mobile connectivity and use of electrical appliances, leading to a better standard of living. Again, this was a study conducted by STPI in 2019. Because PPF has supported 13 megawatt creation of renewable energy, both solar, hydel, wind energy, and biogas. The rate of return on irrigation is 51% FIRR and 57% EIRR. It was again third-party assessment. And PPF phase 3, it was World Bank phase 3, had contributed to completion of 11,000 students at the primary level, and 6,000 students at the middle level, and 3,000 students at the matric level through community schools. And we also provided healthcare and mental and neonatal child care services through facilities where 12 million women and men are reported to have benefited from public and private sector facilities. Next. So this is just the concept and reality that GOP has adopted PPF strategy of poverty graduation. And as I mentioned, the NPGP is one of the example. But we have a lot to do. The poverty graduation has to be institutionalized. Normally, you all are experienced professional, that 3-year or 5-year projects do not sustain interventions, do not upscale it to the country level. There are currently 9 million households benefiting from Benazir income support program. So we are talking about almost 10 million families. So it needs institutionalization of the model. Until unless it is institutionalized, standalone one project or two projects is not going to address the issue at scale. So we're trying to undertake advocacy with government, and obviously all the distinguished audience sitting here, they can all influence policy. SDPI has important role, so we need to work more on this so that the government of Pakistan can institutionalize it. And I'm very pleased to share with you that Ministry of Poverty Alleviation is now working on a policy framework through which the graduation model will be institutionalized, hopefully. And that's something that I think would create a lot of difference in the coming months and years for a sustainable poverty alleviation at the household level. A little evidence suggests that the present anti-poverty programs in Pakistan are fulfilling the key and objective of social protection. Again, this is SDPI study. HDR 2019 framework of analysis that looks at inequalities by going beyond income, beyond averages. Beyond today, two systematic shifts will shape the 21st century. And climate change, technological transformation. So we now have to look at the challenges of climate change also. Rural areas cannot develop just by looking at the crops. Limited resource to work around value chains that would help people to graduate out of poverty. We have to capitalize on natural and cultural heritage sites for self-pride, for self-reliance and interdependence. Spreading thinly versus deepening programs should leverage upon previous work and take it to the next level of value towards local economic development. There are some policy and also comprehensive competency of implementing partners, how to ensure quality manpower in rural settings. So these are a few questions that I leave to the audience for policy advocacy. And I thank you all for your patience, audience.
Transitioning from incremental to exponential. This was the last slide that Nadir Saab had, and that we need to take bold steps now. Thank you, Nadir Saab. Nadir Saab, please take your seat to the panel. Curious to explore other options and other types of validation on poverty graduation, PPF moved forward with Imran Rasool and the team at SERP to develop our second RCT with a focus on further assessing what can benefit households the most, assets or cash. Today, we will hear from Dr. Rasool on how such interventions change the economic preferences of households. Dr. Imran Rasool is a professor of economics at University College London, director of the Center for the Microeconomic Analysis of Public Policy at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and co-director of the James M. and Kathleen D. Stone Center on Wealth Concentration, Equality, and Economy. His research interests includes labor, development, and public economics, and his work has been published in leading journals, including the American Economic Review. He had been editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association and co-editor and director of the Review of Economic Studies. He was awarded the 2007 IZA Young Labor Economist Prize, the 2008 CSIFO Distinguished Affiliate Award, and ERC Starter Grant in 2012, and a British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship in 2018. In the same year, he was elected as a council member of the Royal Economic Society and served as a council representative on the RES Executive Committee. In 2019, he was jointly awarded the J. Johnson Award in Economics. In the same year, he was elected as a Fellow of the British Academy. In 2020, he was elected as a Fellow of the Econometric Society, and in the Queen's Birthday Honours was awarded the Order of the British Empire for services to social sciences. Now I have the honor of inviting Dr. Imran Rasool to present evidence on big push interventions and their impact on economic attitudes of households.
Thank you, Uzma. Can I just confirm you can see my slides okay? I can't, my camera's not starting with the Zoom link, but hopefully you can hear me and see my slides okay.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. So thank you to everybody at PPF, and SDPI for inviting me to be able to present this work today. This is a long-running collaboration we've been engaged in with PPAF since around about 2012. We started this sequence of projects that looks at evaluating some of the types of graduation program that Nader was just describing. And so the paper I'm going to present is more recent work that tries to understand whether these types of interventions impact the attitudes of households as well as their economic outcomes. The work I'll present is joint with a PhD student of mine, Nicholas Sarkez, Adnan Khan, who's based at the LSE and is chief economist at the Foreign Office in the UK, and Anam Shoaib, who's a researcher at the SERP Research Institute based in Lahore. So, the motivation for the study is, as we've just heard in the previous presentation, understanding how to design social protection programs is something that every government throughout the developing world is grappling with. And increasingly, we have the use of poverty alleviation programs that target transfers directly to the poor. And now there's a body of evidence that suggests that transfers, either in the form of asset transfers or large-scale unconditional cash transfers, may have some beneficial long-term persistent impacts on the economic well-being of households, enabling them to graduate out of poverty, not just as measured by income or consumption, but also measured by the assets that they hold and their resilience to various shocks that might occur. So very much along the lines that Nader was just previously describing. What we do in this paper is to go beyond the study of those types of economic outcomes to understand whether these types of big push intervention, providing either asset transfers or equivalent high-valued unconditional cash transfers to the ultra-poor in rural Pakistan, actually impacts economic attitudes of households. We're going to consider attitudes along three dimensions. The first is their preferences over redistribution. What role do they see the state in playing in redistributing resources from the rich towards the poor? The second dimension is in terms of their beliefs about the market. Are they more pro-market as a result of having experienced these interventions? And what happens to their trust in neighbors or some measures of social capital within villages? And so there's lots of different attitudes we could have potentially measured. We think these three are particularly important to understand in the context of graduation style programs. And that's because by providing large-scale assets to the poor, we not only impact the economic standing of the poor, as has been documented in some of our earlier work, and I'll recap briefly later in the presentation, but it's also going to change the ranking of households within villages. So our interventions are going to be targeted towards ultra-poor households. So with a poverty scorecard of a measure of between 0 and 18, but that means that because there are benefits for those households, they're actually going to overtake households who were just ineligible. So with a poverty scorecard of say 19 to 25, for example. So there'll be changes in the relative rankings of households in these villages as a result of these interventions being so effective. And we also show in the paper that because the poor benefit so much from these interventions, there are actually measurable changes in village level inequality. In particular, inequality in villages reduces as the poor improve their economic standing. So there's changes in levels, rankings, and inequality as a result of these interventions. And that might naturally lead households to change their demands of what they believe about what the state should do with regards to redistribution. Another key reason why these types of graduation programs are so effective and lead to persistent graduation out of poverty is that it allows the poor, the ultra-poor, to move away from casual wage labor employment to combining their labor with various forms of capital or assets that are provided. And as a result, deepen their engagement in various types of market, in labor markets, in capital markets, and various types of output market. And so that experience of engaging more in market exchange may well change the pro-market beliefs of the ultra-poor. And then another big concern that's been raised is that as we have interventions and improvements in economic development, that might come at the cost of social capital within villages. So there may be changes in relationships, informal relationships within villages, as we increase households' economic standing and their desire to engage in more anonymous market exchange. So we want to try to understand whether these types of interventions also just alter the social fabric of village economies as a result. And one way we're going to measure that is to look at whether that changes trust in neighbors or altruism towards other households that are co-located in the same village. So the intervention that we're going to be evaluating takes place in 88 villages in 4 districts in rural southern Punjab. And the 2 interventions that we evaluate here are the graduation style programs. In the first treatment arm, will provide ultra-poor households in these villages in-kind asset transfers, where households can choose a menu of different assets up to a value of $500 from those that are provided. The vast majority of households choose some form of livestock when given those options. And then we combine that physical capital also with human capital to also train them in the use of those assets. So the total value of the in-kind and human capital transfers in that set of villages, in that first treatment arm, amounts to $620. So that's why I referred to these interventions as big push throughout. These are very, very large changes in resources that are targeted towards the ultra-poor. And in the second treatment arm, it's identical to the first, but on the menu of assets that we offer households, the final asset item or line item on that menu is that we give households the option just to take an equivalent one-off unconditional cash transfer of the same value of, say, $620 rather than any of the assets that are offered. And when households are given that choice, 95% of them prefer to take the unconditional cash transfer rather than taking any of the in-kind transfers that are offered on the same menu. Now, in some of our earlier work and in earlier presentations at PPF conferences, we've discussed what are the differential impacts of giving households these types of in-kind asset transfers, and how does that compare and contrast to giving them unconditional cash transfers? I'm not going to discuss those differences today. I'm going to combine these 2 interventions and just focus on the impacts on the attitudes of households as a result of these 2 interventions. This is going to be a partial population experiment. So throughout, we're going to have a number of different types of households that we're going to track. There's going to be 2 stages of randomization. The first stage of randomization takes between villages. So in one group of villages, in a third of our 88 villages, they'll be held as controls where the ultra-poor are offered neither the asset transfer nor the unconditional cash transfer. And then in a separate third of villages, they'll be offered the in-kind asset transfers. And in the final third of villages, the ultra-poor will be offered the unconditional cash transfers with the cash transfer as a separate option, where I just told you that the majority of households choose the cash transfer. That's going to refer to the control group, treatment 1, treatment 2 villages. Now, within each of these villages, we're then going to track over the course of the next 4 years households that were poor, the ultra-poor who were targeted by the intervention, as well as households who are not poor. So those households who have a poverty scorecard from 19 up until 100 that also reside in the same villages. So we want to try to understand whether the implementation of these types of graduation programs, these big push interventions that target the ultra-poor, don't just shift the attitudes of those households who are beneficiaries, but do they have any impacts on the attitudes of those households who are not beneficiaries of these interventions? And then within the ultra-poor households, we didn't have sufficient resources to give the offer of the treatments to every ultra-poor household. So within the ultra-poor, we actually randomized which of them are actually offered the intervention. So I'm going to make a distinction between the treated poor, those households that are ultra-poor and were randomly assigned to receive the interventions, and the not treated poor, those households who were also ultra-poor initially, but are not offered the interventions and therefore get overtaken in their economic standing as a result of the treated poor taking up the interventions. So there's going to be 3 groups of households whose attitudes we're going to look at and how they're changing over time: the treated ultra-poor, the not treated ultra-poor, and those households who will never be eligible for the interventions are not poor themselves. Okay, and so this just shows you just briefly what happens to the economic outcomes of households when we combine the two treatments together and we don't focus on the distinction between asset transfers and cash transfers. We see, for example, in the first column, livestock ownership relative to the control group when no intervention is offered increases by about 16 percentage points after 1 year after the interventions roll out, and that intervention is sustained up until 4 years later. Similarly, irrespective of the intervention that's offered, the value of livestock owned increases by 14 to 12% over the next 4 years. Households are much more likely to have an iron roof. They're much more likely to be able to consume the milk that they're producing. And food expenditures rise by the end of the 4 years by about 4 percentage points. So on a whole range of economic outcomes, there are large and sustained improvements in the well-being of the ultra-poor as a result of these graduation interventions, whether we provide them one-off asset transfers combined with training, or we allow households to take the equivalent unconditional cash transfer. So there are large changes in their economic standing, but as a result of the impacts on the ultra-poor, they overtake in economic standing the ultra-poor who are not treated, the not treated poor, and they reduce inequality with those households who are never eligible, the not poor. So given that background of big changes in economic outcomes, rankings, and inequality, the core of our analysis then says, well, how does this translate into the attitudes that these three groups of household have along these three dimensions? So to measure redistributive preferences, we ask household heads 4 different questions, and we comprise those into an index. So we ask them, for example, should the rich give part of their income to the poor? We ask them about their perceptions of the rich. Do the rich deserve the income that they have? We ask them specifically how much of a windfall should be redistributed. And we ask them, are you concerned about inequality in Pakistani society as a whole? And we use those 4 measures to construct an overall index, which we call their preferences for redistribution. Then in terms of their pro-market beliefs, we ask them 4 separate questions about their beliefs in individualism, meritocracy, materialism, and how much they trust people in general, which is important for anonymized exchange in markets. Again, we construct an index of pro-market beliefs based on that. And then the third dimension is the extent to which they trust their neighbors, where we ask them 4 separate questions that ask them about how much they expect their neighbors to behave well, whether they feel the rule of law operates, whether they perceive crime to have decreased, and whether they overall feel safe in their village. So that gives us 3 different indices of attitudes measured across these 3 dimensions. And the next figures just show you some descriptive evidence on the distribution of those beliefs in the left-hand side figure. So this is amongst the poor. There's lots of variation in terms of how redistributive their preferences are, or how pro-market the poor are, or the degree in which they trust their neighbors. And the right-hand side figure just shows across the poverty score decile, moving from deciles 1 to 4, which correspond to the ultra poor in our sample, to deciles 5 to 10 that correspond to households with a poverty scorecard of 19 to 100, what their attitudes are. So generally, we don't see much difference in attitudes between the rich and poor. And it's the case that households in our villages are generally more pro-redistribution than they are pro-market, and they're more pro-market than they are in terms of their trust in their neighbors. And so what we then look at is, how do these attitudes change as a result of being exposed to these interventions, either because they directly benefited from the interventions, or they observed other households in the village benefiting from the intervention. In order to do that, we combine these 3 different attitudes into just one measure, which we refer to households as either being left types or right types, where left type households generally favor more redistribution, they're less strongly believing in the market, and they trust their neighbors less. Okay, so right type households are those that are classified to be less redistributive, believe more in the market, but actually trust their neighbors more. Okay, so we can classify all of our households into either having a combination of right type preferences or left type preferences. And then when we look at what is the impact of exposure to this intervention in terms of the likelihood for households to be right type relative to left type, we find the following results. That for those households who were treated themselves, those ultra poor households who were direct recipients of these interventions, we find 2 years after the interventions are rolled out, and this is combining whether they received the asset transfer or the cash transfer, we find them 9 percentage points more likely to be right type households. So they're more likely to favor less redistribution, they're more likely to believe in the market, and they're more likely to trust their neighbors. Those impacts, however, die out 4 years after the intervention starts. So the ultra poor, in terms of their attitude, although they're shifted 2 years after the intervention, over time they converge back and their attitudes are not permanently shifted. They revert back to what was in what we observe in the control group. They're the results amongst the treated poor. If we repeat the analysis amongst the two other groups, the not treated poor and those households who would never be eligible, we actually see that attitudinal changes are actually very similar across households that are either ultra poor and received the intervention, ultra poor and did not receive the intervention, and not poor altogether. That in a sense, attitudes can shift as a result of the interventions, but attitudinal shifts do not change as a result of being a direct beneficiary of the intervention. Attitudes in these villages change because the village experiences these interventions as a whole. In other words, attitudes are more a function of what they observe around the village as a whole, rather than their own self-interest in terms of what happened to that household in terms of whether they were a beneficiary or not. There's very similar changes in attitudes, but none of these effects persist across any of the groups 4 years after the intervention start. So as a final way to try to understand whether the interventions generate long-term change, we look at voting behaviors. So during our study period, there were some high-stakes local elections that took place in 2015. And so we asked, does exposure to the interventions change the likelihood that households actually voted in these local elections? And then what we observe is that for all households, we see significant increases in the likelihood that they vote in local elections of between 6 and 9 percentage points. So there's quite a big increase in political participation of households as a result of the interventions. But then when we look at whether those participations differ, depending on whether the household is left-leaning, centrist, or right-leaning, we find irrespective of the political preferences of households, all of them are much more likely to engage in the political process as a result of these types of graduation interventions that are targeted towards the ultra-poor in their villages. So to conclude, what we find is that big push graduation type interventions that are targeted towards the poor have large and sustained impacts on economic well-being of the poor. They change the rankings of the near poor who are overtaken, and they also measurably reduce inequality in villages. They are able to shift economic attitudes of households 2 years after the intervention, and it shifts them towards right-leaning attitudes, so to believe less in redistribution, more in the market, and to trust their neighbors more. But those changes in attitudes don't depend on whether you're a beneficiary, but depend on common exposure to these types of policies. These impacts don't persist, though. In the long run, 4 years after the intervention starts, households revert back to what the attitudes of the control group. And all of the results I've shown you don't really differ depending on whether the initial allocation is given in terms of assets to the ultra-poor, or whether the ultra-poor choose unconditional cash transfers of a similar value. So these interventions do more than just changing economic outcomes. They also change attitudes and voting participation. So we think that that's an important new element to describe about the role of graduation programs. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Imran, for sharing your profound knowledge and delving into the economic preferences, beliefs, and voting behavior of households. We hope to leverage this valuable knowledge in the design of our upcoming programs. We now move forward to the next part of the session, empowering communities for sustainable poverty alleviation strategies, scaling, and sustaining impact. There are always aspects that need to be explored and learn more. I would request the panel chair, Ms. Chandana Khan, to conduct the discussion.
Assalamu alaikum to everyone. I'd like to thank CI for hosting this panel and for having the panel. I'm feeling the big shoes of secretary, so I hope that I can manage. I think this was a lot to digest. All the data analysis. Those of us who work as practitioners in this sector, it's very useful to hear this because you often question yourself and say, okay, we're doing all this.
Ma'am Shandana, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we can't hear you. Those of us joining online are unable to hear you.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, thank you.
Just go. So what we've been hearing is, it spans a whole gamut, and I'm just thinking, how do we get a handle on all this information? It made me think of last year in June when I visited this village called Japuka in Rizal district up north with Shoaib Sultan Saab, who chairs the RSP network. And the first thing the manager of that LSO said was, when he got up, he said, I think it was 120 households. And his next statement was that there is no poverty in this village. And, when you hear things like this, then you think, okay, all of us doing this must have done something right somewhere. So it's very good to hear the data and how this substantiates. And I think an important sentence, and I'd like to quote Dr. Imran Rasool, is that because the village was organized, the village experienced the interventions as a whole, not as individuals. And I think this is a very important point, that the interventions may go to individuals, so everybody doesn't get the same intervention. But the fact is that the impact on the village and other interventions that have collective impact is what brings people together. And I think what we're talking about not is that single cash transfer, but how is this impacting that community? How can we scale it and how can we sustain it? So on that note, I'd like to, there are so many questions here that Arshad Saab has given. Arshad Saab is getting very confused with these questions. Half the time I'm trying to figure out which question to ask. So what I've done is, just to focus a bit, I have identified the three of the sub-questions. And I'd like to put them before you and request the panel and the speakers and also the audience to take part. I think we have about 25 minutes, so maybe 10 minutes per question. So the first question I'd like to put before you is, in what ways can collaboration between various stakeholders, such as local governments, NGOs, and community members, and I assume that includes TTOs as well, be optimized to enhance the development and sustainability of third-tier community institutions? And I'd like to add to this by saying to improve the overall governance at the local level. So I'd like to open up this question. Aisha, would you like to try and address this? I know it's a huge question. Thank you. Thank you very much, AF and SBI, for bringing this very useful panel discussion. Panel discussion and is this on? And speakers together. So as I was listening, as Shandana also said, this is a huge, poverty itself is a huge thing. But the things that were kind of coming to my mind, and again, I speak more from the urban poor and urban communities perspective. One of the things that really kind of still I'm looking for answers and still is a little grappling for me is that in many, particularly in urban communities, community institutions of the poor are either very weak or missing, and NGOs step in to fill in that role.
as implementing partners, as service providers, as trainers. Even in many of the PPAF graduation programs and service delivery programs Nader Saab was telling, that's exactly what you're seeing. But what interests me is that NGOs have to transition from becoming implementing partners to actually strengthening the community institutions that are there at the grassroots level, whether they are in villages or they are in urban communities. And that transition is dependent on how strongly the community is participating. So if, and that's something that we are in Akhtar Hamid Khan Urban Impact Lab looking at, that paper is in that process based on a 4-year intervention that we did. If you look at the community participation using the community participation ladder by Arnstein and categorize it, with the lowest rings of the ladder being non-participation, and then 3 steps being informing or consultation. What we have found in many programs, and ours included along with other programs that we have informally looked at, that it's a very token participation. So with the result that the NGOs do not really transition into strengthening the community institutions and the community organizations. So in effect, what happens is the NGO becomes the middleman with no exit plan. That in itself, so if you look at the other way, what it flips into is strong NGO service deliveries may not necessarily allow strong community institutions to emerge, because so much of the learning and the service delivery, they kind of become conflicting interests. So that's one thing, that how do, in graduation programs, in service delivery, in other interventions, how do NGOs transition from their active role into actually strengthening community organizations? So that's one thing. I would just like to add one more thing, that in our 4-year intervention, working with very low skill, and again, we also had an in-kind asset transfer equivalent to almost $500 in the previous 2019 dollar conversion terms. It's a very critical period. When a program finishes, the next 3 years are a very critical period. So all of a sudden, from a lot of attention of mentorship and training and asset transfers and visits, all of a sudden, when a program finishes or when the recipient graduates, all of a sudden there is no connecting facilitation. So I was very impressed to hear that 39,000 infrastructure projects and other projects sort of self-sustain. But essentially, that's where the state and citizen connection and responsiveness comes into mind. So where do programs, when you've done your programs, how do they connect into the next level? And that often is not part of the program design. The program is designed without any thought of what will happen post-project. So post-project sustainability is not just, did the recipient do business or not, because that will happen. And our own data on 132 women shows that at the end of 2 years, 132 women were involved in low-skilled tailoring and other women traditional businesses. But when we looked at them 36 months and we followed them at 1 year, we followed them at the 2nd year, and then we followed them at 3 years post-intervention closing. At the 3-year mark, only 15%, only 20 women out of the, And there were many, many reasons. So those are the two questions that I feel that the traditional looking at graduation programs from subsistence to ending to no further connections, the post-program design should also be part of the program design.
Rural communities are more gross in that sense. Nadir sir.
Well, I
Go
think,
ahead.
in fact, what we need to look at is that most problems, lie at community level, at the village level. And the lowest tier of government, the governance is local bodies. But I think after 18th Amendment, even prior to that, now these are the provincial governments that have to ensure installation of local government. But unfortunately, what we have seen is that whenever provincial government elections are held, they try to delay local bodies election. That's a very major issue, I think, that the provincial governments need to make sure that they strengthen local bodies, elections are held on time. There had been an attempt in past devolution of power, but unfortunately the fiscal devolution did not take place, due to which the system again was reversed. So I think number one is that the government's presence at the lowest level, the governance has to be local bodies, and that needs to be strengthened at some point. Secondly, what we have seen is that even in the presence of local bodies, the engagement of communities, giving them voice, organizing them into institutions, that has proven to give results, not only in Pakistan, but in many countries, even in Asia. So for that, we need to have a kind of policy framework where local bodies and these community institutions have to work together. And for that, I think the community-driven local development policy framework, two provinces, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan, they have formulated these policies, but again, challenges would be to making finances available for implementation of those strategies. So I think we need to institutionalize these setups. Only then the synergies and coordination can be strengthened. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to add to this, the link between these the TTOs, and I saw somewhere a figure of 1,000 or maybe a bit more PPF, and I think this overlaps with the RSP figure is 2,600. Let's say about 2,000, maybe almost 2,000 Union Council level community institutions, fostered by various donors and facilitated by various partners and NGOs. And in the case of two programs, and these were EU funded, they were not government programs, Brace and Success. There were forums at the tehsil and district level between the heads of TTOs and the district administration. This did not include political people. They were the DCs, the ACs, and the district administration. And it started a process of coordination where the TTOs had plans, which in this case, it was the RSPs helped them make the plans, and they put these plans forward. There was sort of, some success in some areas. So there were schools activated, there were BHUs reactivated, there was collaboration on tree plantation. I don't remember the figures, but all I know is that once the projects ended, the system ended. These meetings pretty much stopped. Now, this is the challenge we all have, that what happens? I mean, this is a governance challenge at the local level. And you're right, two provinces have these policies. But if you look at the Balochistan policy, it doesn't really look at all the work put in place, say by BRSP, where the poorest are included, the women are included. It doesn't do that mobilization or ensure that inclusion. So any NGO, I can get together with three of you and apply there. And who is going to make sure that, I'm the poorest or I'm not the poorest. So I think there's the collaboration between organizations that do this work and government needs to be strengthened. Can I request either Dr. Hamna or Dr. Kate Viboni for any comments they may have on this? The issue of, sustaining TTOs and impacts on overall governance?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. And I just want to thank USMA and PPAF in general for this long-standing collaboration, which has been really fruitful for us and for learning more about this sector. I think I can speak about what we've learned based on working with TTOs over the past, few years and thinking about the governance structure. So what we've seen in our work is that overall, generally, there's so these TTOs are providing a forum which is bringing together people even within these communities. There's a lot of diversity. We have women that are part of the management. Then you have people who are from poorer households within the community with relatively wealthier members from the community. You also have individuals in the management and as part of the executive bodies who are not educated, and then their members who are educated. So they're kind of institutionalizing a forum and providing a platform to bring together a really diverse group of people. And within that, what we've seen is that inclusion of women and inclusion of members who have more education, that's linked with improving restrictive gender attitudes and gender norms. So we asked in one of our surveys, we asked these TTO members who might be better in terms of decision making regarding TTOs. And a lot of the members said that men in general are better at decision making regarding the TTO. But on average, those who were more educated, they were less likely to state that women are not as good as men to make these decisions. And that's something that's also, very strongly come out in Dr. Rasool's, presentation, that, these interventions and having these organizations and graduation interventions has helped in changing attitudes at the grassroots level. And the other important thing I would say is that we've also seen that, having this diverse group has helped with better organizational practices. So organizations where there are more women, where there are more educated members, they're more likely to engage in better governance practices within the organization. They're more likely to hold regular meetings. They're more likely to hold meetings in the office rather than in a private space. They're more likely to track their expenditures and their receipts. They're also more likely to maintain records of financial flows, etc. So again, I think this gives us some idea of places where we perhaps may need to build, encouraging more women, encouraging education within the management structures, because this might be an important way in building sustainability. And of course, the stuff that Dr. Kate presented in terms of, recognizing these communities, we found that organizations that were all women, that were just run by women, are much less known in their communities, despite the fact that they're doing great work. I think all of these kind of help us, they kind of shed light in potential areas that we can perhaps work on and take them forward from a policy perspective.
One of the and thank you for bringing up women's inclusion, because in many parts of the country it's a bigger challenge, and in some parts it's a huge challenge still. Sometimes I wonder, like when we do gender training, we've been saying the same things for 33 years. When is this all going to change? But the challenges continue. Now, just linking this, I mean, we're talking about the internal dynamics of these institutions, but what about their interaction with, say, politicians, with government? Because this is very linked to their sustainability. As you know, and as Aisha was saying, the project comes and then the project goes, and our staff goes and the interaction goes. So what we want to leave behind is a capacity at least to make the system more accountable. Would anyone on the panel or the panelists or the audience like to talk a bit about that? How can we make, and now with the election coming up, I mean, maybe this is an opportunity. I know that there are so many LSOs where candidates go to canvass. They are local politicians. Some of them are also MPAs from those areas. Where I remember once in Kotli Satya, we went and they said candidates from every party had come to canvass. And of course, they said that, you know, do this for us, do that for us. They were a mixed bag of voters in that village, like there are in every village. But maybe this is one way to make more headway than just working with the local administration. Yes, Aisha.
Question that he saw, they saw in the study an increase in the attitudes, economic attitudes, and then sort of a sliding back over the next 2 years. So some thoughts maybe on that, because that may explain that TTOs become functional and active, and even in Dr. Kate's presentation, 30% were not inactive. Does that mean that 70% were active? I wasn't quite clear on that, but it would be interesting to hear a little bit on what causes that back shift. Within the teachers, intervention and
Okay, so Dr. Rasool, coming back to interventions and, you know, their impacts. One of the things that you presented was that there's an impact of this, or lasting impact for 4 years, and then it slides back. What are the reasons for this? It's just the nature of the intervention, or what is it?
So Ma'am Shandana, I think Dr. Rasool had to leave, but I wasn't sure if you wanted us to speak to the previous point regarding the TTOs kind of becoming active or inactive, because I'd be happy to come in on that.
Sure, please go ahead.
Sure. Okay, sounds good. So, I mean, I think our sense from looking at the data and from seeing some of the field work is seeing some of the TTOs in the field, which are all we've been so impressed by the work that they do. I mean, they're basically volunteer organizations, and I think there's a natural life cycle that can happen. And I think before we ever went to the field, this is also something that many from the RSPs and from PPAF also observed to us as we were starting our discussions, that, you know, they have a cyclical activity, and that's just a natural consequence of people get involved, then they get, maybe something comes up in their lives and they get busy, and it's not a job, it's something they're doing because they care about it, because they're wanting to serve their communities, because they're motivated in those kinds of ways. And so I think what we think is going on you were asking, ma'am, about the number who became inactive. Yes, there are a substantial number who become inactive by the end line, and that's because, you know, we start out with a sample that are active, and then some of them naturally will become inactive. Some of them become active again in the future, but others don't. And so I think that what we're trying to understand is, can we, by any intervention and support from the higher level, help them to kind of stay active and invigorated for longer? And it looks like actually we can. I also wanted to add on the point that was being discussed earlier, that many of these organizations, by the time of the end line, weren't necessarily getting any funding from external donors, and yet many of them were still active in their communities. And it does look from the results of the RCT like that recognition may have helped to kind of cement the institution. So I think basically the question is, can we, when we're still funding things, we, meaning the development community, as a development community or funding community is still funding these organizations, do we have a possibility of strengthening the institution such that it stays active kind of beyond the period of funding? And I think it seems like from the results of our study that we've shown so far, that the answer is optimistic, that yes, there are things we can do to strengthen them so that they stay alive longer. Now, there's never going to be any guarantee, because when people are doing volunteer work, it has to compete with other things that they're doing. But I think that there's room for optimism here.
Thank you. I want to request Khalil. Khalil is sitting here, and he's been a ustaz and teacher to many of us here. And he's looked very carefully at the BRAC ultra poor the graduation model. I mean, what is the major difference really between what we do, because there are very similar components, and what BRAC is doing, because BRAC has also met with a lot of success?
Thank you so much. The BRAC experience, poverty graduation, is based on evidence generation. As you know, BRAC is 50 years old, more than that. And every few years they do evaluations, research, assessments, and from that they draw lessons and then incorporate them. 22, 23 years ago, when this exercise happened, they found out that about 5, 10, 15% of village households were not included in the community institutions. They were excluded, they were marginalized. This was explored. Why? Then various reasons of social exclusion, economic exclusion, and then they started this program. When it started with asset transfer, they saw that asset transfer wasn't enough. Other things were needed. Education, health, nutrition, family planning. So the whole ecosystem needed revamping. Luckily for Bangladesh, their governments have been investing in human capital since the last 20, 30 years. So in that sense, their foundation was laid. Access to school, access to health facilities, in which the government plus the civil society had a huge role. BRAC itself had 50,000 schools. The key thing was they had a mainstream programs, as we heard about PPF or any other NGO, RSP, but this was a specific program focusing on the ultra poor. And it was multi-input program, sequential program, time-bound program, and the key intervention was the mentor coach. This was a staff member whose duty it was, responsibility it was to ensure that his 150, 200 ultra-poor households begin the process of getting out of extreme poverty. So graduation means many things to many people. But for BRAC, the essence was, has that extreme poor household begun the process of getting out of extreme poverty? Are they included in the village institutions? Are they saving money? The assets that they have got, are they being well managed? Are they growing? Are their children going to school, getting to health facilities, etc., etc.? In our case, and I've been part of this for a long time, our focus has been on creating this institutional infrastructure. The community organization, the village organization, and the union council level local support organizations, which is very good, excellent. Now, if we go to India, to Bihar, the ultra poor program in Bihar is a shining star. The government of India, the Bihar government, the donors, they all love it. Why? It is effective, it is on scale. And the reason behind that is they are using community institutions like our CO, VO, LSO. So these community institutions are key local stakeholders. If they exist, they should be involved. So I think the learning from BRAC is, Chandana, focus on outcome. When we traveled last year across Pakistan, no VO, no LSO, no district office told us, like your case in Gizar, how many people have graduated. It wasn't on the agenda. It wasn't outcome oriented. It was all input.
We have given so many courts, we have given so many irrigation channels, we have given so many solar, everything, all the inputs. But the outcome,
I think in the end, we need to revamp our monitoring systems, our evaluation systems, our research systems, learning and knowledge management, and use all that for evidence-based advocacy with the government. As another subset, end of the day, if 9 million people are BISP beneficiaries and we want to graduate them out, this can only happen with the government. So government has to take the initiative, and we have to support them, facilitate them, and provide evidence to them. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalil. Would anyone from the audience, if you can introduce yourself and then.
Saifullah मेरा नाम है जी. I run a consulting firm out of Toronto and Islamabad. We do work with UN and other research work. I've done in the past work in Africa also, looking at similar sort of issues. One thing which I wanted to learn, ये जो community level के जो infrastructure, जो organizations जो बनाई गई यहाँ या बांग्लादेश की जो बात कर रहे थे, does or do women play any role in their management or in their working? And if they do, I wonder if Dr. Kate's study, which talks about active and inactive TTOs, did they apply a gender lens to see when women play a role in the leadership role or in the management of that, do they sustain more? Do they have a different outcome, or it's just similar in terms of they just going out?
Thank you. Kate, either you or Dr. Hamna, would you like to address the second part of the question, that the role of women in the TTOs and, do they sustain, what are their sort of sustainability prospects or indicators you look like where women participate more?
So I think it'd be great if Dr. Hamna speaks to this.
Sure. I think there are a couple of dimensions that I can talk about when it comes to women's role. So what we find is, again, everything that I'm speaking about, this is not, this is all correlational based. So the results, so I would just like to make that qualification. But what we do find is that organizations where there are more women in the management, we don't find that to be correlated with better governance practices. However, we do find that when women form the majority in management, they tend to do more projects that are targeted towards girls and towards women in those communities. So we don't find evidence within of female-led or organizations where there are more women to be having better governance practices, but we do find that they're more likely to focus on work that targets women. What we also find is that, interestingly, the partners, which is, the partner organizations, POs, when we interviewed their respondents, like their representatives or their officials, we find that they tend to have perceptions about the quality and the performance of TTOs, where there are more women. And in terms of thinking about more, I don't remember if
I'm sorry, Dr. Hamna, we can't. We didn't hear the last part of what you said. Could you repeat that? Okay, Nadir sir.
Thank you. If you look at our country, culturally, we are a very diverse country, and in different regions, in different areas, we have different experiences. As development professional practitioner, I would say. What I have seen, like in Sindh, for example, the success program that Shannon just mentioned.
That's all.
Yes, Ms. Hamna, you can complete and then I can comment. So in Sindh, for example, the success program is completely led by women. So they are at the forefront and they are leading the whole show. In other parts of the country, where we have, more sort of communities where women are parda observing, or like some parts of Balochistan, Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. In those areas, we have seen that, yes, women have played their role. Like PPF's interest-free loan, for example, 66% is with women. They are very good in savings, in lending, in interest-free loan. The recovery rate is encouraging compared to male. Men have contributed more into the infrastructure. But what we have seen that women, yes, they do contribute. And all this movement of social mobilization is basically culturally sensitive. So in areas where men and women cannot sit together, so there are separate community institutions for men, separate community institutions for women. But when they undertake this development planning exercise, that is a stage where voices of women are also incorporated into the development planning. So you cannot fix, one thing in all areas. So keeping in view the cultural diversity of the country, so you have to mobilize communities in that respect.
Thank you. What Ji Hassan sir, this the last question we've been told to wind up. Ji.
Thank you, Chandana. We need to rethink and redo these studies, because after the flood 2022 and the dollarization or price hike of the dollar, all those who were just above the poverty line have sunk down to the below poverty line. Now the poverty and the resilience and the indicators and the measures for future resilience would need to be redevised.
Thank you. I've been told I should summarize. I'm really wondering where I should begin because I have 3 pages of notes myself. But I think one thing we have seen is the effectiveness of these programs if there is a commitment to fund them and also to scale them. I know that there are many institutions working on this, but the scale of the problem is so big. Very often, those of us who worked in AKRSP, we are told, oh, but that area is very different. We don't see this anywhere else. Well, that area has had a concentrated input since 1982. The rest of the country is much bigger, and it depends on where you go to look for what we do. You can't drive down the motorway and say we don't see anything happening. So I think one is the commitment of resources, because the knowledge is there, the expertise is there, and I think we should be proud that this is locally produced knowledge, and we are all local people working on this. And those experts who've looked at it and who've dissected it, we have seen that this works. But I think the key thing is that the government really needs to own this more in terms of, I don't mean just one ministry, I mean all the departments who need to work through these 3-tier organizations or the tiers below them. And there are some TTO networks as well in some places. And if that commitment doesn't happen, then this approach can't survive on projects. Projects can only demonstrate, put in place a capacity. So with that, I would like to thank everybody on the panel, the speakers, and all of you. And Abid Saab is not here, but I would like to thank SDPI for hosting this panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Extend my gratitude to
Thank you so much.
Kate Viborny, Nader Gulbaraj, and Imran Rasool. Special thanks to our distinguished panelists, Hamna Ahmed and Aisha Khan, as well as our esteemed chair, Chandana Khan. We are grateful to Abid Solari Saab. We're grateful to our chief programs, Arshad Rasid Saab, for conceptualizing this debate. Also express my appreciation to our audience for participating and making this a collaborative experience. Thank you. Allah Hafiz.